Yes. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll give it a minute or two as everybody joins, but just some quick notes. We do have the Q&A section open, and you guys can ask questions at any point throughout the broadcast. We're going to leave time at the end to answer all the questions. And if we don't get to your question, you can head over to Twitter, and we will be answering any question we don't get to on Twitter, or if you think of something afterwards, feel free to jump on Twitter and ask us. We will be there for a little bit after the webinar. You will also be getting Russ's presentation today and the recording of the webinar. So if there's a link that you need or a slide that you missed, you'll be getting all this in an email from us afterwards. For everybody new that's joining, I will just keep saying this. The Q&A section is open, so you can ask questions in the Q&A section at any point throughout the presentation. We're leaving time at the end. And if we don't get to your question, we will be answering questions on Twitter afterwards, or if you think of a question after the fact. And we will also be sharing Russ's presentation. So don't feel like you have to furiously take notes. You will be getting a copy of all the slides and all the links.
We might as well just jump in.
Yeah, I think we can kick off. So for those of you that don't know, this is Russ. This is our CEO. In addition to being a multi-time founder, so having gone through the fundraising process multiple times and selling his first startup to Facebook, he's also an angel investor, and he mentors startups through the fundraising process. So he has all of that knowledge he's going to share, plus all of the research from our fundraising data that we have. So he'll be taking you through how to raise a successful seed round even during a pandemic. So take it away, Russ.
Thanks, Andrea, and for everyone listening. And Andrea is the real brains behind all of this research. So she does all the heavy lifting along with the team at DocSend, and so I get to talk about it, which is really fun. But thank you, Andrea, for actually putting this together. And so I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll get started on it. But before we get into it, I just want to say that part of my personal motivation for doing this type of research is because when I was fundraising for my first startup Pursuit, I got a lot of very anecdotal feedback from people around like, you should do this or you should not do that. And I was kind of wondering like, well, what in aggregate is true or not true across a larger set of companies? And so this is really meant to answer those questions. And this specifically looks at the seed round. And so this is across thousands of companies. They have raised billions of dollars, but we're just looking specifically at the seed round here. So as Andrea said, Russ, co-founder and the CEO at DocSend. The first startup I had, we sold to Facebook. On one hand, it was a failure in that we didn't build a real business. On the other hand, it was a success and that we sold it. And then DocSend is actually, in my opinion, a real company. The reason that we have this data is because so many people use DocSend for sending their pitch decks around. And it's a combination of analytics around, are you reading my pitch deck? And then security, like who can this be forwarded to or not, and keeping control. And that's what makes our software so attractive for the fundraising use case. Although we do have over 14,000 companies that are customers. So, tons of like sales teams use us, in financial services, like commercial real estate. There are a lot of people who want to like send and track and control their documents. So it's pretty horizontal as a technology. So all the data in here is opt-in from founders. So that we send people a survey, and many of them opt in to this. Like we have a very high opt-in rate. But if you get an email from us in the future, if you use this for fundraising, please say yes and take the survey. It's really helpful to give back to the community just to know like what is true in aggregate. And then we've worked with Harvard Business School historically on this stuff. And we do try to keep it like very accurate, very like 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 relevant. Like the numbers are big that we're working with in terms of like participants. So this is really the only data set that I know of that like is this helpful around fundraising and what you should or shouldn't do. A couple anecdotal things I'll say before we get into the data itself. Fundraising is, in my opinion, one of those tasks that you have to work smarter, not harder. And what I mean by that is, if you're in sales, you can just keep trying, keep calling more people, spend more hours on it, and you'll probably sell something. Like, sometimes it's just work harder. You're going to get there. Keep grinding it out, grinding it out. Fundraising is not necessarily like that. You can just try for years and fail. And so you really need to be open to feedback. You need to be open to iterating, and you have to be very smart about how you go about it. You do have to work hard for sure, but you don't be mindless about it. And so the fact that you're on this talk is really helpful in the sense that you're open to learning more and to figuring out how you can go about this best. So keep that in mind. This comes up in a bunch of ways in the stuff we're going to go through. The second thing I'll say is that fundraising is hard, and you should be prepared for that, especially for the seed round. The seed round is the hardest round to raise. And there's a problem in startups in general where we see the ones that are successful, and the startups that are successful have no incentive to say that was tough to get here. Why would they say that? There's also a lot of failure, and the people who fail don't want to talk about it. So you just don't hear from them. So you're left with this, like, all you hear from are people who say, yeah, I raised my seed round. That was really easy. It took me like a week. And so there's just a lot of bias, but for most people, it is very difficult to raise. And even for those who are successful, you primarily get no's. You mostly get no's. You get a lot of no's. There's no one I've ever known who hasn't gotten a bunch of no's in fundraising. And that's going to be tough. So tell your significant other that you're going through this. Tell your co-founders you're going through it, and be prepared for a lot of rejection. And then even if you're successful, you need to get back to building your company. That come into this knowing that it's going to be tough. All right, so let's look at the average pitch deck view. So the average seed deck, this is different than a pre-seed deck. This is different than a Series A deck. This is specifically seed, is 20 pages. It's viewed for 3 minutes and 27 seconds. And a quarter of the views are on mobile devices, which is really high. So as you're thinking about like how dense should the words be, what are you putting on slides? Just remember that 1 in 4 views are going to happen on someone's cell phone, so they're not going to be able to necessarily see the nuance and the detail in your deck. It's got to be very very obvious and easy to understand. And 3 minutes and 27 seconds is a long time to be viewing your deck. So people are spending a significant amount of time actually reading what you send them. And this is specifically the send ahead deck that gets you the meeting. That's what we're looking at here, are the pitch decks that get meetings. So in terms of what the process looks like for a seed round, the seed round is the hardest round to raise. We refer to this as the seed squeeze. And at least anecdotally, the way I think about it is that the pre-seed you can get by just saying like, we're going to do it. You pitch a big vision, or maybe you don't even do a pre-seed, you just do friends and family or something. But the seed round is where you actually have enough. You have to have enough to like look at around like, are people using it? What have you built? There's like enough information that people can like really start to judge you. It's not just a song and dance type of thing, but and this used to be true of the Series A. There's a Series A crunch, now it's the Series seed squeeze, because you have to have more information earlier. And so relative to the pre-seed round, you have to contact more investors, significantly more investors. You actually have the same number of meetings though as the pre-seed round, and this is also the same number of meetings that you needed like 5 years ago. So it's really interesting that like this is very stable in terms of actually having just about 40 meetings. These can also be repeat meetings where like you'll meet with an associate, then you'll meet with a partner, then you'll meet with a partner meeting. Those are all counted as three meetings here. Average raise is 1.8 million. This is bifurcated a little bit. So in this data set, about 33% is outside of the US. And for that group, it's about 1.3 million raised. And for companies in the US, it's about 2.5 million raised. So, if you're thinking about like, if you have a fundraising ask and you're in the US, 2.5. If you're not in the US, then it's 1.3. But I'll cover this later. But I do think a lot of the gap is more of a skills gap rather than if you're not in the US, you're less valuable. Like software is global these days, but there's definitely a skills gap. And then weeks to close, 21 weeks. That's a long time because you're not building your company. You're just fundraising. And the way this is measured is your first investor meeting to your last investor meeting, 21 weeks. We'll cover later how long it takes between your last investor meeting or signing a term sheet and actually getting your money. But 21 weeks, like first to last meeting. But remember, this is the hardest round to raise. It only gets easier from here, although unfortunately, like most companies that raise a seed do not make it to Series A. But to the extent that you actually hit the metrics you want and can raise a Series A, that process is easier. And we're working on research to show exactly what that looks like for the Series A. So stay tuned for that in the coming months. Okay, so hey, we're in a pandemic. This is really weird. It's really different. And we still have to all like start and build companies. And the question is, are investors still investing? And how has that process changed? So we've got what we call the Startup Index, where we're tracking real time, like week to week, across a few different metrics. What we're looking at here is just how much time investors are spending in these pitch decks that are being sent on average. And it's interesting that it's significantly down over the past 2 years. However, this is not necessarily bad news. The volume of investors looking at decks is way up over the past 2 years. And the volume of founders sending decks is way up over the last 2 years. So, I mean, from talking to some people, what I think is happening here is investors cannot go to conferences. They can't go to trade shows. And in my opinion, that's a very inefficient way to meet people and information exchange. So everyone's stuck at home and they have more time to look at your deck. So if you're fundraising and you're sending your deck around and you're getting intros to people, they have more time to look at your deck and they're looking at way more decks. They're just being more efficient about it. They're spending less time in them, and that just puts pressure on you as the entrepreneur to be very, very clear in describing the opportunity and what you're working on. So that was true before. It's just been accelerated. It's true across a lot of things in the pandemic. The trends that were happening before are just accelerating in many ways. Okay, so one of the things that's a little unintuitive, but really interesting, is that more time spent viewing your deck is not necessarily good. So what I mean is that decks that are successful and raise money, and also, by the way, in our data set, we have both successful decks and failed decks. So when entrepreneurs respond saying, sure, I'll participate, the first question is like, were you able to raise successfully? And when they say no, that's still really valuable. And then they tell us a lot about what happened for them in the fundraising process. Like, I tried for 6 months, I couldn't raise money, I had to shut the thing down. And then we look at their deck as well and like the viewing behavior. And so we're looking at successful decks and how VCs viewed those decks, and decks that were unable to raise and how VCs viewed those decks. And so that's what we're looking at here, is the difference between the two. More time is not better time. A great deck is one where the investor flips through it and the whole thing feels obvious all the way through. And then at the end, it's like, well, yeah, why isn't this a big company? This seems super duper obvious. And whenever an investor is confused about something, they pause. There are a couple exceptions, which I'll talk about here. But yeah, like more time is in many ways a sign of confusion. All right, so a couple of things I want to call out here that are interesting data points. And remember, this is across thousands of companies. So like you might think, oh, that's like not that big of a difference in these bars, but it is significant across this many decks. So there are a couple areas where failed decks have a lot more time spent. The appendix, the business model, why now? And to start off with, I would say, please do not include an appendix in your send ahead deck. You can have the appendix in the deck you are like presenting in person. Usually an in-person presentation, if it's going well, is more of a discussion and less of like a PowerPoint show. The appendix is helpful if an investor has a question and then you have a slide to answer it. It proves to them like, I have thought about this, here's the answer. It's not an off-the-cuff answer, I've thought about it. The appendix in a send ahead is weird because you're making people ask questions they wouldn't necessarily ask. And remember, your deck is supposed to be a narrative that convinces someone to take the meeting with you. The appendix does not really fit with that. So I would not include an appendix in your send ahead. But people do, and in failed decks, there's more time spent there. The business model, so more time is spent in the business model. I find myself doing this when I am looking at a deck and I get to the business model section. There are some business models that just make sense. It's like B2B SaaS. We charge people for our software. Like, okay, that makes sense. If it's really complicated, or there are like multiple business models, like we have multiple revenue streams, and I have to spend more time reading it for longer, this is not a good sign. This doesn't mean I'm like, oh, I'm very impressed. I'm like, I don't get it, and therefore I think this is probably not going to make it. And then the why now section, if that's confusing, yeah, then the more people are spending time on it, and we'll cover it in a second, but yeah, I would recommend just don't even have a why now slide in your deck for the seed. For the pre-seed, definitely include a why now. For seed, no. Areas where people spend more time, and that's a good thing. The main one, main couple ones, product and team. So for product, there's also twice as many product pages in successful decks versus failed decks. And the way I interpret this is that the successful decks actually have more of a product. So they have on average like 4 pages of 4 slides about their product, and therefore people spend more time viewing those pages because they have more to show. If you get to the seed stage and you're asking for $2 million and you don't have a lot in terms of product, you're likely not to be successful. So in your decks, make sure the product pages are ones you actually think about, are thoughtful about, and make sure you really have a product before you go out and raise. Like if you're thinking like, I could do it now, or I could do it in 3 months, but in 3 months, I'll actually have a lot more to show for it. You can afford to wait. You should probably wait because the product is really key at the seed stage. And then the team, like spend time on your team page. It's really important. Link to your LinkedIn. If your name is John Smith, or even anything that's like hard to Google, like when you're asking investors to go Google for you and then find you on LinkedIn, just link to your LinkedIn profile. So it makes it easy for investors to see, like, is this a real person? Because that's one of the first things someone asks when they're looking at you, unless you know them personally, like, is this a real person? Is this a real team? Who are they? Where are they? Are they legitimate? And so the team page is something people spend more time on in successful decks. Okay, so what we're seeing here is the percent of decks that actually include this category of pages. What's interesting is that no category of slides has 100%. The team is the closest, so definitely include a team page. For sure include a team page. It's mind-boggling to me that people are raising millions of dollars on a deck that doesn't have a team page, but some people do that. And then you can kind of see things like drop off here: company purpose, problem, product, solution, transition, market size. I should also note that we're using Sequoia's framework for a business plan. So on their website, they talk about the components of a successful pitch deck or a business plan. And so all the decks that are in this data set, we go through and code the pages to say, oh, this is a team page, this is a product page, this is a solution page. And then we can say, like, well, how many of the decks actually had that category in there? It's really interesting to me that financials is something that less than half of decks have, but like pretty close to half. That's a lot of decks that have financials. At the seed stage, your finances are not great. A lot of this is financial projections in the future. Typically at the seed stage, it's like you've got traction, that's important, but it's kind of hard to have a 5-year plan. So I would just say don't include financials in general. About half and half have the ask. I'd say include an ask in your deck. As we'll see in a minute, there's some pretty clear market terms, like we know how much on average you have to give up in terms of equity, and we know on average how much you're going to get in capital. And so ask for that. If you think you're hitting the traction to raise a seed round and have enough to show for yourself, ask for 2 million, ask for 2.5. I make it a clear ask, because then the investor can actually decide, like, hey, this is a fit for me or not. Because some investors will only invest in pre-seed, some only in seed, some only in A, and without an ask, they don't know where to bucket you. And then these are all things you should consider, and it also depends on your situation if you're going to include them or not. And in terms of ordering, like, so this is great. If you're like thinking to yourself, like, oh my God, I don't know what to put in my deck. Just make it easy for me. Like this is the page that just makes it easy for you. And so this is like the order of each section. For sure, this varies by situation. So like if your team is just phenomenal, like you as a founding team are the best thing ever, maybe put that earlier. But you know, all things being equal, this is a good way to like have the deck be ordered. Like you don't want to start off with your funding ask, for instance, like the first page, like we're raising $3 million. It's like, oh God, I don't even know who you are, what you're doing. I don't, you know, so put that at the end. Starting with your company purpose is great because it's like, oh, you're a social network for dog walking. Got it. Make that easier. And then you're like, well, what is the problem? This is kind of a logical like set of things that kind of like draws someone through a narrative. There's also a good rule of thumb where someone should be able to get your deck just by flipping through and reading the titles of the slides. Like that's a good way to go through it. And then the pages themselves like give you more information. And again, here, see how much time is spent in the product section. So definitely pay attention to how you do your product section. It's also worth noting that in DocSend, if you put an animated GIF in a PowerPoint and upload that to DocSend, that animated GIF plays. So that's a good way to have like a feeling of like motion, like so you can see your product in action. It's like a mini demo. But yeah, having product pages kind of come alive and like show what you're doing is a great way to get additional engagement and also to make people impressed and also make them confident that what you built is interesting and you're really smart and that they should take that meeting with you. Okay, so I mentioned earlier the why now page and why I think you should not include that specifically for the seed. For pre-seed, absolutely include a why now, but for the seed, it actually having a why now page correlated with not being successful by like a significant margin here. Like you at the seed stage should have enough to show for yourself that people aren't asking the question why now. You're saying, this is a thing, it's going to be big, here's what I have to show for it. Not like, I've got a concept, this is why this concept makes sense now. What you should do instead of having a why now page is basically address the fact that we're in a pandemic and talk about what's next. You would be shocked the number of decks that you know we see in the research and also just we have a product called the DocSend Fundraising Network where we'll make introductions for seed round companies. And you know, people submit their decks and then we match them with VCs. But as we review decks, the number of them that don't address that we're in a pandemic is very high, and it's very shocking. But every investor is thinking about it, and so you should also address that and talk about, you know, like what is next for you. I'm gonna just take a second to look at the Q&A. So minimum, just list off a couple of them and then I'll address them kind of as we go through. Minimum runway needed at this time, 18 months. Depends on your business, how much runway you should have. 18 months is the general rule of thumb. I think that's safe. Some people say forever, some people say 6 months. I mean, when you look at the number of weeks it takes to fundraise, that's really your kind of like how much progress you're gonna make, and then leave 6 months to like before you're out of cash. Like if you have 6 months or less, you need to be out fundraising. So if you have 18 months, that means that you've got 12 months to make enough progress to hit that next milestone such that you're confident you can raise more money. Best practices for send out deck, pre-meeting, pre-seed raise. Well, pre-seed is a different topic entirely. But for the seed round, sorry for going out of order on these things, but we'll let's address them. The reason you have a deck to begin with is that VCs can't take every meeting. It's not good for you or for them. And the deck is basically a way for you to show enough information that a VC can decide to take the meeting or not. So traditionally, the way you get meetings is through people who know a particular investor, and you send them your deck and you say, hey, would Jeff be interested to chat with me? We're raising a seed round. And then that person forwards it to Jeff, and then Jeff looks at your deck and then he says yes or no to the meeting. This happens just every day. This is what VCs do every day. They're just like going through decks that people send them. If you apply cold on the deck, on the like site, if you go to like Uncork and like submit your deck there, it varies by firm, but that has a very low hit rate. Like the likelihood that a VC will get back to you is quite a bit lower than if you are going through some sort of warm intro. I think this also accounts for a lot of the difference in the amount of funding that people get. It's not because of the actual geographic difference, it's because of a skills gap and like a network gap. But yeah, so sending your deck ahead of time to get meetings is a great way to go. And I'll cover like best practices around like meetings in a second. How to raise when there's no traction yet, but get the meetings with VCs. I'll loop back to that one at the end. From a timing perspective, focus on angels or VCs from a 1 million raise. These are good questions. How do you define the seed round? The seed round is defined as raising, like, well, one, it's self-identified. We ask people what round was this for you, and they say it was the seed round, because to some extent, all these things are made up. It's just arbitrary, but you know, there is a market for this. People like decide, oh, this is a seed round. That is a moving target over time. The seed round is definitely getting larger in size, and the pre-seed round came out of nowhere over the last like 6 years. And so we're just trying to track like what is in the market. And so seed round is defined as people, that's what they said they raised, and that is 1.8 million on average, and it has these characteristics. And there are firms that focus just on the seed round. And so a firm that focuses on the seed round goes to their investors, their LPs, and says, hey, we're going to invest this amount, this average check size. And so we're raising a fund that's, you know, 50 million, 100 million bucks. And so we're going to be able to make this many investments. And we think some of them are going to be rocket ships, and therefore we'll have this return profile. So they actually have like a defined range of check size. So, you know, if your 100 million fund and, you know, they have a minimum check size of $500,000 and you say we're raising $400,000, you're just not a fit for that firm. They can't even write you a check if they wanted to. You need to raise at least $500,000. And so that also dictates like there is a seed round. And this is kind of the definition of where it is. I'll keep going, but these are great questions. Keep submitting them, and I'll loop back to them as we go. So this is really important in terms of like, how long should I plan on not being productive at my company? Because when you're fundraising, you're typically not as involved in the day-to-day. And I do get this question from people like, how do I like have the business keep running while I'm out fundraising? And typically at a seed round, you don't have a lot of redundancy at your company. You're not like hundreds of people. So as the CEO, you can like give away everything to other people to cover for you. You as a CEO are often a critical path for something at your business. And yeah, that makes it hard to fundraise. So your goal as the CEO is to get the money raised and get back to building as fast as possible. And you know, there's quite a big distribution for how long it takes to raise a seed round. This also relates to the come prepared thing. 30% of companies, it takes them more than 24 weeks to raise their round. Like these people aren't bragging about that. They're probably not saying it took them that long, but 30% is a lot. That's a long time to be like out there grinding away, like trying to raise money. And then we all see the things in TechCrunch where it's like, oh, they raised a huge amount of money and it took them like 5 hours. Only 15% of companies take 6 or fewer weeks to raise. And this is from first meeting to last meeting, remember. So it's not actually that many that are in that annoying category of like, man, they just made it look so easy. You know, the average here is, you know, 21 weeks, which is a really long time. And as I said, this is the seed squeeze. This is the hardest round to raise, especially now in a pandemic. It takes longer than it did before. It takes more meetings than it did before. I should also add that a lot of this fund research is from like last year, but it is still true during a pandemic. Some of the things are just magnified. Like you have to contact more people. But remember, like investors are still investing just as much. Everyone has the same size. So like seed deals are happening. So you don't have to worry about not being able to fundraise. Like the fundraising market is like moving at the same velocity. It just takes a little longer for you, which is unfortunate. And everyone's gotten comfortable investing without ever meeting in person. Just Zoom calls, maybe a few more of them. It's fine. The investors are smart people. They've adapted pretty quickly to the new normal. So this slide and the next one talk to the point about working smarter, not harder. So, you know, and this is one of the things where like the anecdotal feedback or advice I got when I was raising the first time was around like, yeah, it's important to get warm intros, like it, you know, but quality over quantity. And so what we're looking at here is the number of investors contacted. And so these are like warm intros or cold outreach. This is just self-reported by the founders in our data set. But the number of investors they contacted, and then how many meetings did they have. And what's interesting about this curve is there's like it falls off. So they're diminishing returns. But in general, if you contact more investors, you will get more meetings. Ta-da, makes sense. My guess is, well, and anecdotally it's true, some of the ones on the right where they contacted a ton of people, they were just not great quality. Like they were doing cold outreach and therefore they didn't have as many meetings per outreach because they weren't being that smart about their outreach. Like one person said they had contacted 1,000 investors and we emailed them being like, did you like add an extra zero there? Is that real? And the person's like, yeah, I did. And like, how? And they were like, oh, I hired someone who was full-time reaching out to investors. And I was like, do you recommend others do that? They're like, no, it was a bad idea. So quality over quantity. And, but you are going to get more meetings if you spend more time contacting investors. What's especially interesting though, is looking at the amount raised versus investors contacted. Almost no correlation. So this speaks even more highly to the fact that it's really about quality, not quantity. And so, you know, when I advise companies or, you know, talk with startups about this, I usually say, like, if you can get, you know, 40 meetings with investors and you still get a no, you still don't get a yes from anybody, instead of contacting another 50 investors, you should probably think about what should I change, or what's going wrong here, or like what feedback have I gotten, and try again in 3 months. There's actually no lost face if you try again in 3 months. Investors are happy to invest again, like at the seed stage, like if it takes you a little bit longer. You just have to have something new to show them, like, hey, we've made progress. Even if it's just, you know, you say you made progress, but really what you just mean is I've redone my deck. It makes a little bit more sense now. Like 3 months later, people will say, have to take that meeting. And so make sure when you do your outreach that they're warm intros, and focus on quality, not quantity. All right, so this is just a sad slide. I wish I had like a better message around this, but it is something that we track, and it is something that we should use as, you know, the start of a discussion. But when we track this information, we ask the CEOs in the data set, like, you know, about if they self-identify as a minority and gender. And so all male white teams raise the most money at the seed round. This is different than the pre-seed round. The pre-seed round, diverse teams, diverse meaning either gender or ethnicity, actually do the best. But at the seed round, it's the all white male teams that raise significantly more money. So what we're looking at here is that all female teams raise 21% less, and then teams where a founder self-identifies as a minority raise 17% less. It's also worth noting that minority depends on the region. So if you're a white person in Africa, well, depending where you are in Africa, then you'd be a minority. Or if you're like a US person in Japan, you know, you'd be a minority. So, you know, but again, like 33% is outside the US, and 2/3 is in the US. So primarily that means, you know, all white male teams. I don't know how to fix this. Like there are definitely strategies for how to get around it. It's also not like a death knell. This is just across a big data set. All female teams and minority teams are raising a lot of money. Like they're having success. This is just relative. And so that's what we're tracking. And that this is the kind of the divide that's there. But remember, like if you're wondering like how much should I put on that what we're raising, I'd say like if you're in the US, like 2.5 million is a reasonable number to say that you're raising for your seed round. So this is something we're looking at like age. As a founder, age is not something you can really do anything about. Like you are the age that you are. And so if you're starting a company, off you go. But what we're looking at here is the age of the founders that are raising. And again, this is just for companies that successfully raised a seed round. And so being in your 20s, like that, the group that was in their 20s did the best. Both in terms of like amount raised, they got the most, and they had the fewest investor meetings, followed by 30s, 40s, and then there's a big drop off for people in their 50s. It's interesting to note that and you should look it up, our pre-seed data that we released is different. And the pre-seed data shows that for that round, people in their founders in their 30s actually perform best for fundraising. So we don't know why there's such a big gap between pre-seed and seed. It could be just a disconnect with the investors. Like the pre-seed investors are distinct typically from the seed investors, and they just have different criteria. But this isn't like shockingly different across the groups. It's just something to be aware of, that there appears to be a bit of ageism at the seed round specifically. There's also a bit of regional bias. And so, you know, the West raises the most in the seed round. It's also worth noting that by the West, we don't mean like Montana or like Iowa, or sorry, Idaho. This is really just like San Francisco, Seattle, LA. It's like big cities on the West Coast, which is where all this data is coming from, followed by the Northeast, New York, basically, the South and the Midwest. But more important than this difference in funding is, I think, the reason this difference in funding exists. And it's, in my opinion, and from looking at a lot of decks and working with a lot of teams, it is not because of where you're based. Like, if anything, if you're based in Philly, the dollars you raise will just go further. That's great. Like, there's a question like, do you have access to talent? And like, yeah, you do in Philly. There's a lot of access to talent there. And so it's not that that makes the company unattractive. Being located there, I think it makes it more attractive. And so why are companies raising less in those areas? I think it's a skills gap. And what happens is that, you know, a lot of founders have like mentorship, you're an accelerator, like there's a lot of like word of mouth for this information about how to raise, how to build a company, and having access to that information is what determines how much you are able to raise and your success rate. So even just being on this, watching this video, like, awesome. Like, if you're not an expert in fundraising, like, this is very helpful for you to like try to close some of that skills gap. And this is a lot of the reason like we do this research, we do this content, is to try to help that skills gap, because it's not necessarily fair that someone in San Francisco just happens to like meet people and be taught and mentored and stuff like that. And ideas are great from anywhere. So I think everyone has smart ideas. It's just the game of fundraising is a very specific one that you do need to learn. Okay, so what to expect from an offer? I do get this question quite a bit around, like, so some entrepreneurs like really try to optimize for not giving up equity, and so they're saying like, oh, I only want to give up 10% of the company, you know. And this is one of those things where my advice would be like, just do what's average in the market. Just that makes it easy, because what you should be optimizing for is getting from fundraising back to like doing your actual job, which is building your company. Like, that's, you don't want to be fundraising for 30 weeks. That's bad. Like, get it done quickly. And the best way to get it done quickly is to just kind of go with these numbers. So assume you're going to give up 20% of your company. So if, you know, the simplest math would be, we are raising $2 million for our seed round, and the pre-money valuation is $8 million. So the post-money valuation is $10 million, and I have given up 20% of my company to raise $2 million. Like that is just an easy way to go with it. There is another question around like, well, what do you need to show for yourself to be at that place? That's a little bit trickier to answer, and it really depends on your company and where you're at. One way to get advice on the seed round is to go talk to an investor who does Series A. And the reason I say this is that if you try to go to a seed investor and ask for advice, they are just judging if they should invest in you. So they will not give you advice. They're just like judging you, and you don't want that unless you're ready to raise. But if you go to a Series A investor, they're hoping that their advice will be helpful to you. You will successfully raise your seed round, and when you're ready for the A round, you'll remember them, you'll reach out, and they'll have a competitive advantage to be able to do your Series A round. And so they'll be able to say like, yeah, this level of traction, not quite great enough. Like the way you should describe it is law. Like I got hung up on this part here. Like that's the way to do it. So anyway, seed round, you're going to get 20% of your company. Also, 10% is allocated for an employee option pool. You're going to be hiring people. You need to give them equity. Equity is great as a way to use equity, not cash. And that's 10%. So if you've already created an employee option pool at the pre-seed round, then you just need to top it off to 10%. You don't need to do another 10%. But if you haven't done one yet, then yeah, you're going to need to create like a 10% option pool. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, that just comes out of the founder's stake or the pre-existing cap table, basically. So you're going to be doing 20% for the money you're raising, 10% or up to 10% for the employee option pool. So you're actually going to get diluted by 30% in your seed raise. That's a lot, giving up 30% of your company. 10% is for employees, so that's important. But it's significant. So if you're doing well, you can make more progress and just skip the round. Do that, but typically you want to raise so that you can scale and go faster, and you're trying to build a big company. Like there are a lot of ways to just create a good business, and you should do that. Venture specifically is about creating big businesses, and big businesses are ones where you get there fast or not at all. And if you find yourself in that situation and you're raising a seed round, then it is totally worth it to give up 30% of your company to move faster. So choosing a lead investor, this is so important. Sometimes when I talk to companies and they're like, oh, can you make some intros? We're gonna raise. They're like, oh, I really want like Sequoia or Andreessen for my seed round. And I'm like, well, why? Why is there a partner there that you like a lot? Or like, I don't know, it's just like people like gravitate to name brand. But when we ask successful investors, successful entrepreneurs who raised a seed round, like why they chose their lead investor, like this is what successful people say. And I'm like, yay, you're being smart about it. Name brand, last thing on the list. Number one thing, industry specific experience. Do you want someone on your team, like your investor on your team, who like gets what you're doing? You do not want to be educating them around like, what does it mean to be in our industry? Like that's tough. That's going to be time consuming, and you're more likely to get into arguments. And it's also worth noting that you cannot get out of a relationship with your seed investor. You're probably going to give them a board seat. They're going to be with you forever. You cannot get rid of them. So take this super seriously. This is like marriage level seriousness. 20% number, second best was they got along the best. And so like that's really it. It's like pick the person you get along with, and pick the person who like understands what you're doing. I should also say that what I've heard, and it's been true for DocSend as well, has been don't necessarily pick the best term sheet or the highest term sheet. Choose the investor that you want to work with. That's more important. Like if it's like a 8 million pre versus a 9 million pre, but you really like the firm that is the 8 million pre, go with them. And then take name brand with a grain of salt. Like you're going to be at this for a number of years. Name brand really doesn't matter. Pick who you want to work with. Okay, key takeaways, part 1. Keep it short. So you only have 3 minutes and 27 seconds. So 20 or fewer slides. Some people are like, oh, well, I think I can get it done in 10 or like 10. And some people are like, well, I really need a minimum of 40. And I'm like, if you have too few or too many, you're probably doing something wrong. Like it's not worth it to have 10 pages if you make those pages really dense. Remember, like 1 in 4 views takes place on a phone. So, the pages need to be like pretty readable. And remember, people are just kind of like flipping through this thing. So you've got basically 20 pages to make an obvious narrative. Also, just leave the appendix slides out of the send ahead in general. Like if they're that important, they should be in the main deck. If they're not that important, that they're in the appendix, don't have them there. It's fine to have an appendix, but keep that for like an in-person presentation so you can address things as they come up in a discussion, but they shouldn't be part of the original narrative. Give it time. So 21 weeks on average for first meeting to last meeting. Make sure you've got enough runway to cover that. Make sure that you've got help you're not going to be as productive at work. So it is annoying, but hey, it's, on average $1.8 million. So that's meaningful. That helps you accelerate your business. It's worthwhile to go through this process, and choose your VCs wisely. Like, you're in it for the long haul. This is, we started DocSend 7 years ago. And, I still talk to our seed investors all the time, and they're wonderful. We're very fortunate to have good ones, but be thoughtful about who you pick, because it's a long-term relationship that you're getting into. Remember, quality over quantity. I cannot stress this enough. Just remember that there's no correlation between the number of investors you contact and the money that you raise. Like, once you think about that for a little while, it's kind of mind-boggling, because you do need to reach out to a lot of investors, but only reach out in situations where you've got a good connection, or you've been thoughtful about it. And that's a good way to go. Also, just to reiterate, like, DocSend has a product called the DocSend Fundraising Network, where we'll make seed level introductions for you, specifically to lead seed investors. We're pretty stringent on the criteria. We only accept about 20% of the pitch decks that are submitted to us through it. But the investors that we have in our network are incredibly high quality. It's like 60 or 70. We've got another 100 on the wait list to get in. But we're very good at, like, matching you to investors that like your type of company specifically. And in terms of, like, building your list and doing your own outreach, remember, try for 50 to 60. And make sure that they are specifically focused on seed rounds. So, like, Uncork is one of our seed investors, Cowboy is one of our seed investors, Lair Hippo Ventures is one of our seed investors. They all focus specifically on seed. Sequoia occasionally does a seed investment, or Andreessen, or partners at later stage firms often have the ability to make seed investments. It's just not what they do. It's, like, not their primary business. So you want to make sure you target firms where, like, they focus on seed. You're going to get a better reaction. They're going to move faster. They're going to get what you do. And you're also going to get more of their time, and they're going to be more helpful to you. And lastly, put in the work. Your pitch deck is really important. And a lot of times I talk to founders, like, oh, it feels like homework. I got to put together a pitch deck. Like, why doesn't my business just describe itself? And one thing that's going to be true for the long haul for you as a founder is that your business will typically never explain itself. It seems obvious to you, but it is not obvious to other people. So you have to put in the work to make the narrative clear, concise, and obvious. And it's useful because you're going to be doing this forever going forward with customers and employees and partners and your next round of funding. Like, you're going to be constantly trying to describe to people what it is your company is working on and why it's meaningful. I mean, we have this all the time when we're trying to close candidates that, we're pitching the best candidates on, like, why you should work at DocSend. Like, why is this such a great company? And it, to me, feels very similar to how, like, we craft the narrative that we use for our own fundraising. And so this work that you're putting in now is going to be worthwhile, and it's going to stick with you for a long time. So we got this newsletter every week. It's awesome. Nick from our team puts it together. They're really interesting interviews with founders, with VCs. It's just solid gold. It's great content in there. Definitely worth signing up for if you're a founder at a startup going through this stuff. I'll spend a few minutes just covering DocSend and why you would use it with your deck. So you're sending a link, or you're sending a DocSend link instead of an attachment, or instead of a Dropbox link or something. And the reason you do that, number one, you can see if they're reading it or not. I've been shocked the number of times that, I get when we were seed fundraising, people would just not read the deck at all and say not a fit. And so for me, I'm like, oh, well, you didn't even read the deck and you're saying not a fit. So I know it's not the deck that's the problem here. Or they read the deck like 5 times and then they forward it to their partners. And I'm like, wow, you're really serious about this. So you can see how long people spend on each page. And people often will try to, like, trick DocSend, like switching tabs and back again. We track that. So this is like the actual time they're actually spending on the deck. Also, access control, especially at the seed round, you've kind of got enough, like, traction, or you built enough that you kind of don't want it to be sent to one of your competitors. So you can see, like, and control who has access to it and who's forwarding it to who, which is really important. So it's like, who is this Chris person? Like, oh, they got it from Richard. I can ask Richard, why did you forward it to Chris? What is Chris's involvement in this thing? And I can also say like, only Richard can access it, but Chris can't. And so you can have all these rules around like who can get into it. And it's still very friendly for the recipient. And then, yeah, when people say no, you just turn off their link. Done. Every time you send it, it's a unique link. And so you have this dashboard of your links, you just boom, turn it off. And then if they try to go back and look at your deck later, we notify you. It's super gratifying. If you're going to get a bunch of no's in your seed round, and then like 6 months later, one of the people who said no to you is going back trying to look at your deck and they can't get in. It's a really gratifying. He's like, ha ha ha! Now you know that you are regretting your decision. You can also see aggregate information around like where are drop-off points, which is useful because you're contacting 50 or 60 people. And then the deck is like constantly in motion, typically, like as you're getting feedback, you're reacting to it. And so this allows you to update it, and every link you've ever sent has the latest version, and you're still tracking who's looked at which version. So that's really useful to know. Like, did you look at the old one or the new one? And you know, if you haven't seen the new one, I have to address that. But if you saw a new one, not the old one, I don't have to address the differences there. And then keep in mind that you can have multiple DocSend accounts and switch between them. So like I have a DocSend account for investor relations. I have a DocSend account for our sales team. I have a DocSend account for like fundraising activity. And so you can just switch between the DocSend accounts because there are a lot of use cases for it. So that's an ability that we have. And then in terms of what's up next for us as a company, we're building out all of the e-signature. Hooray. So that'll be out later this year. So everyone who has a random HelloSign or DocuSign account, hopefully you can just switch to DocSend for that part of your workflow. And then we have a data room product called Spaces today, and we're just building out a lot more functionality there so it can be a head-to-head competitor with any data room on the market. And so we'll have that finished by the end of the year as well. But DocSend is already a great data room that's worth using for investor relations, or if you're in later stage fundraising. For the seed round, you don't really need a data room. Like DocSend's totally fine. Like you're not sending like 60 files talking about your progress. But when you get into like Series B or C, or you get into M&A, then like a data room is something you definitely need because the volume of information you're sharing is much higher. A few additional resources, pitch deck interest metrics. This is on a weekly basis. So, you know, when the pandemic started, everyone freaked out, like, can we raise money at all? What's going on? And so DocSend has a big enough market share of fundraising. Like we get used all the time for fundraising. Like investors are always like, yeah, I'm opening up dozens of DocSend links every single day. It's like, yay. So we track that. And so you can just kind of see what is the health of the market. So it'll be interesting to see if time per deck continues down or volume goes up, or like, but right now it's very, very healthy. It's the best we've seen in the last couple of years in terms of like just the volume of shopping that's going on and the volume of investing. The DocSend fundraising network, as I mentioned, if you want some additional intros to lead investors for your seed round, submit it. It's free. We have a quick turnaround for it. And then there's a pre-seed report that is, you know, similar in terms of what we cover, but the pre-seed round is different. So it's worth taking a read through there if you think a pre-seed round might be more where you're at versus a seed round. And to the question asked earlier, it's you know, it is tricky to say what is pre-seed versus seed. Typically pre-seed is like more idea stage. Seed stage, you need to have traction. Like you've got to got something. Even if it's not revenue, it's got to be like the volume of signups, interest. Like you got to have like something real for your seed round of funding. But it is squishy, and that is frustrating for me and for a lot of people, like defining the two and the difference between the two. All right, I'm going to jump into some of the questions. How to raise when there's no traction yet, but get the meeting with the VCs. So there are a couple like kind of things that VCs will say just to not take a meeting. They'll say like, oh, I need to see more traction. That's just a euphemism for I don't find what you're working on very compelling. Like you need to have something to show for it. Like it can't just be like a note on a napkin or something, like, you know, but it doesn't necessarily need to be like we have skyrocketing revenue. Because at the seed round, you're typically not going to have that. So the question is like, what do you have to show for your time? And like, what evidence do you have from your market that you're on the right track? It could be interviews, it could be quotes, it could be signups, it could be LOIs. And whatever data that you have, you need to make it look compelling to the investor such that they say, you've made a lot of progress. This is really impressive. We'd like to invest $2 million in your company. And yeah, what that looks like varies entirely by like from business to business. So the best way to get to like the, you know, traction thing is, one, create a compelling narrative, get some feedback, like I mentioned, make sure your narrative makes sense. And then, you know, in the context of that narrative, like what do you have to show for the work you've done on your company, and what's the most positive light in which you can represent that in the traction section. And so, yeah, for DocSend's, a seed round, we didn't show a curve or like anything. We just had quotes. We're like, we've done this many interviews. Here are the people we did interviews with. Like, here's what they said about it. Like, this is a real problem. And our lead seed investor's like, yeah, it's a real problem. And that was sufficient for our seed round. But it'll be different for you and your company and whatever you're working on. So from a timing perspective, focus on angels or VCs for a $1 million raise. 1 million is an awkward number. That's like right in the middle of pre-seed and seed. So I'd probably put it in the pre-seed category though. And for pre-seed, only 50% of companies that successfully raised in our data set had a lead investor. So you could go either way. It's like half and half. Half don't have a lead investor, half do. For seed, only 25% did not have a lead investor. So you can put together, you know, a couple $1 million without a lead investor, but it's a lot harder. The pre-seed average amount raised is like $500,000 in the US. And so it's easier to put together $500,000 with a bunch of small checks. And so I think that's why you see that difference. It is always easier. Well, it's always better and faster for you as the founder to raise from an actual firm though. Like if Uncork leads your seed round, they'll typically take half of the round. They can help you fill out the other half of the round. They move very quickly. They're very decisive, and it's what they do all day, every day. Talking to angels, you're leading with it, you're putting together a round. You have to talk to a lot more people, for instance, and then they don't have decision criteria. They have other jobs. They're slower to get back to you. So I usually recommend like going to firms first. And if you have to raise on an angel round, that's fine. Do what you need to do to get the capital you need, but you know the firms are faster. Yeah, when you guys received my deck, the first bit of feedback was too few slides. You said the average is 20, but in Guy and Kawasaki school thought it says to aim for 10. Curious, what's your thoughts? I've always thought a number like 20 is too many. A lot of this stuff is subjective. Like we just have enough in the market here where we're telling you, hey, across thousands of companies that have successfully raised a seed round, the average number of pages is 20. So it's not like this is DocSend being like, we think you should do this. This is just like, this is what's happening. For Guy, him saying that you should have 10 slides, that's a personal opinion on like what he likes or what he's seen, you know, be successful maybe over the course of his career. But it is subjective. And remember, this is an average. It's different for your business. But I can definitively say that it is better to have 20 pages that flow well, where each one's like flip, flip, yep, got it, versus 10 pages where you try to cram it in and there's a higher word count. That is, you just don't see the same engagement with that type of deck. So make sure it flows well and be wary of like it having too high of an information density inside it. Differences to take into account when operating in Europe. Yes, so many. We don't even have time to cover them. Europe is wonderful, interesting, has a really great investor community there. It's becoming more common for European companies to raise from US firms. Traditionally, you know, European investors want to see more progress, and it's less about, is this a moonshot? And it's more like, is this a great business? Versus US investors are like, I need to know this can be a multi-billion-dollar company, potentially. And so the risk appetite is a little bit different. And therefore, how you go about building your company is a little bit different in the Europe versus the US. But I think at the early stage, a lot of this stuff is the same as a founder. Like, try to make progress, show what you have, what you can for the work you've done, and you should definitely be reaching out to European and US investors if you're in Europe raising a seed round. Terms will be slightly different as well. Round sizes are a little bit smaller in Europe versus the US. But again, it's becoming, access to capital is becoming more global. Please define traction. As I said earlier, it just varies by company. like what you define as traction. I think of it as like, what's the evidence you have from the work you've done that you're on the right track, and explain that to me. And that can take various forms. But we're at the top of the hour. There are 31 questions left. I wish we had time to answer more of them. And we definitely need to do one of these again, because this was a lot of fun, and obviously everyone's super engaged with it. So Andrea, thanks so much for putting all this research together. Everyone on the call, thank you so much for joining. And if you have questions, please reach out to support. And hopefully all the best with your fundraising. Remember that even though we're in a pandemic, this is still a great time to raise money, and this is a great time to be building a company. So thanks again.
And just as a quick reminder, we'll be answering questions on Twitter for the next hour.
Exactly. So go to Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.